Great, thanks, Bram, and welcome everyone. So my name is Dean Mervyn. I'm the Global Policy Lead for Freshwater at WWF. So today's session is going to cover one of the latest buzzwords, nature-based solutions. A lot of discussions underway in Glasgow around the topic, purely because it links so closely to the adaptation agenda. And with COP being billed as an adaptation COP, that discussion really centers around how nature-based solutions can be implemented. But I guess the challenge is, and you can see from the title, there are two questions that is on the top of everyone's mind at the moment. So one, what does a large-scale nature-based solution actually look like? Right. So for all the talk about nature-based solutions, how would you go out and actually implement one of these at scale? And the second big question is, how do you even begin to finance something like this? So that's what we hope to start to unpack a little in this session. We've got a great lineup today. We're going to journey from the Mekong all the way to the Zambezi and give you some insight on how to do just that. But before I go any further, I'm going to hand over to Stuart Orr. Stuart is the Global Practice Leader for WWF's Freshwater Practice, and he's going to set the scene for us and tell us why we need to be thinking about NBS at the right scale when it comes to the adaptation conversation. So, Stu, over to you.
Thanks, Dean, and welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today. As Dean said, we have a couple of really excellent presentations coming up. And what we decided to talk about today, and as you can see from the title, is just being honest about how we have learned and what we have learned in our journey to build large-scale nature-based solutions projects in many parts of the world. As Dean said, there's a lot of talk about this, obviously, in COP today, but there's also plenty of hot air, if I'm quite honest with you. There's a lot of people talking about this, but very few are actually getting down to the nitty-gritty and actually figuring out how you actually make this work. So what we have learned along the way is that how do you really get the real facts together? How do you start to put the cost-benefit analysis and the numbers together? How do you build the incentives? How do you understand the political economy in order to have the right conversations with the right people about doing large-scale NBS at scale? It's not good enough that you just have a good project. You also need to be able to influence and make decisions with people who hold infrastructure budgets, for example, that they are interested in spending money on you. So along that journey that we've been on in many parts of the world, we've been working with our great partners like EcoShape and Pegasus, who are going to present to you today. And what we're going to share with you is some of the lessons learned and some of the ways in which we are creating our NBS work. And hopefully the questions will get into how we take them forward, how we finance these. And I'm looking forward to this session today. So we're going to start off by hearing from Justine Shapiro from EcoShape, and her presentation is next. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Stu. Pepin will pull that up. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to share our recent work on the assessment of nature-based solutions in the Mekong Delta. This project was developed under the leadership of WWF in Vietnam and abroad and supported by a team that included EcoShape, One Architecture, and Royal Haskoning DHV. The study drew upon research, analysis, and team expertise to develop 2 site-specific pilots with broader applicability across their regions and for other Asian deltas. We focused on areas in the lower Mekong where nature-based approaches might effectively restore and protect natural systems, and we sought to align these proposals with the sustainable development ambitions of the government of Vietnam. In Dongtak Province, our goals include improving riverine flood management, water storage, and refertilization of agricultural lands. In Kamau, we focused on sustainable coastal erosion management and flood risk reduction. Our work begins with studying the context of this unique landscape, home to over 21 million people. The Mekong Delta is a land of water with an extensive network of rivers and man-made canals. It is the lowest large delta in the world, more than 1 meter below mean sea level, and the delta continues to sink and shrink. Wet season floods play an important role in land building and securing agricultural fertility, but they can also lead to crop and property loss. Dam construction upstream is capturing sediment, reducing the coastal plume and directly contributing to coastal erosion. Other pressures and challenges in the area include salinization due to sediment starvation and riverbed incision, riverbank erosion, which is exacerbated by development encroachment, and land subsidence, stemming from natural processes, but also human activities. While nature-based or hybrid green-gray solutions could be very effective in dealing with most of these challenges, the magnitude of the issues requires an integrated approach. We need to understand the whole system: social, political, economic, and institutional. This system understanding is key. I'll turn first to Dongtak Province. The Upper Delta supports extensive agricultural production. This area used to be characterized by naturally occurring deep floods in the wet season. To facilitate a third rice crop and promote development, local communities have developed an extensive, uncoordinated system with around 20,000 kilometers of dikes. Unfortunately, these actions have reduced flood storage and undermined natural processes. The infrastructure inhibits the beneficial effects of flooding, including counteracting subsidence through sediment deposition, replenishing soil fertility, and supporting groundwater recharge. As a result, we have seen decreasing economic efficiency of rice production and increasing vulnerability due to climate change. While the system largely protects against lower floods, extreme floods will still overtop these structures. As we began to explore how nature-based solutions might play a role in the system, we mapped stakeholders to visualize their roles and relationships. We also sought to understand priorities. For example, the government's ambition to increase the forest area from 4 to 15%. The Tremchin pilot integrates conservation measures with floodplain restoration for improved agricultural productivity combined with new livelihood models. It focuses on enhanced water resource management to demonstrate the benefits of controlled flooding. It also exemplifies how an area-wide strategy can reduce overall flood risk. Its components include expanding the functional habitat area of the national park by partnering with nearby agricultural communities where there are existing high dikes, formalizing the transition zone through designation or legislation, and modifying infrastructure to facilitate controlled wet season flooding. We also began to consider what strategies might best support sustainable livelihoods. Some ideas include alternative farming practices and crops that accommodate changing water levels, creating branding for biodiversity responsible farming practices or supporting organic certification, and diversifying through wet season ecotourism, and last, developing a grant-making mechanism to compensate farmers for flood storage. In addition to these ideas, we propose initiating community-based monitoring and analysis to assess the beneficial impacts of flooding on sedimentation, soil quality, groundwater recharge, agricultural productivity, and biodiversity. And finally, protecting and enhancing river corridors and canals through land use planning and plantings that stabilize shorelines. The pilot will demonstrate how conservation areas and agricultural lands can become complementary and functionally continuous for habitat creation. Controlled flooding is not a new concept, and these strategies for floodplain restoration apply across the Upper Delta and can be scaled up over time. The pilot can demonstrate the benefit of institutionalizing seasonal flooding as part of a flood risk management strategy. Now, I'd like to shift to Kamau. The Kamau Peninsula was historically created by sediment deposits from the Mekong River and has been developed from mangrove swamps into a vast agricultural landscape over the past half-century. Today, shrimp farms are encroaching on and degrading the coastal mangrove belt. This means reduced capacity to capture sediment, dissipate wave energy, and mitigate flooding. The challenges are further exacerbated by declining sediment availability from the Mekong River due to dam building, groundwater pumping, and poor management of wastewater discharge and solid waste. As a result, in many locations, the mangrove belt is unstable, squeezed between coastal dike systems and rising seas. We chose to study a site where the dike system has not yet been constructed. But even here, mangroves are threatened with erosion, salt intrusion, and further risk of habitat loss and inundation due to sea level rise and coastal storms. Here too, understanding stakeholders and relationships is key to understanding their benefits from a project. The Kamau pilot demonstrates the potential for sustainable development integrated with mangrove restoration, a triple bottom line proposition that combines disaster risk reduction with social and environmental benefits. The pilot must be adaptable, designing for the immediate future as well as shifts in the coming decades related to sea level rise and demographic and agricultural developments. It values the ecosystem services that mangroves provide by connecting restoration methodologies with investment in local livelihoods and establishes a regulatory framework for long-term growth. In this way, the pilot can support resilient communities. It aims to capture the return on investment in a sustainable region through increased tourism revenues and aquaculture productivity. Our mangrove restoration approach focuses on stabilizing coastal retreat. It begins with sediment analysis to refine the restoration approach and objectives. We propose updating the framework for mangrove belt protection, targeting 70% coverage within 4 kilometers of today's coastline, new guidelines for habitat continuity, and reserving inland areas for future succession with sea level rise. Natural breakwaters can reduce wave energy and support regeneration, and collaborative wastewater and solid waste management can reduce runoff and pollution. The restoration approaches are paired with economic opportunities. For example, introducing alternative aquaculture and innovations for productivity, creating a certification of integrated mangrove aquaculture, diversifying with seasonal ecotourism, and fostering payments for ecosystem services to compensate the local population for participating in restoration activities. Last, institutional embedding is key. This means updated land use guidelines and a process for monetizing mangrove benefits to compensate some farmers for relocation from the coastal zone. This pilot can inform the approach to coastal restoration and management of shrinking mangrove forests and demonstrate how nature-based investment can improve livelihoods and restore biodiversity, along with agricultural productivity, while buying time for long-term planning. So how can we advance this work? There is no one-size-fits-all approach to funding projects like these. We will need to look to a mix of public funding combined with private investment. Given the longer timelines and lower degree of predictability for nature-based infrastructure, we need to use public money to de-risk the project. Examples include through project development funds, which support project preparation and can demonstrate its financial feasibility and risk profile, and viability gap funds, which can make an economically, socially, and environmentally important project financially feasible. Emerging tools and innovative financing mechanisms might play a role in private financing. For example, pay for performance, impact bonds, and impact financing. The intrinsic exchange is a solution to watch. Private domestic investors may be more willing than foreign investors to take on certain risks, and diaspora bonds for nature-based infrastructure could leverage communities abroad. Bringing together partners and expertise in preparation brings down the cost of capital, reducing construction and operation risks downstream. And we need banks, funds, donors, and governments to increase their funding to scale up implementation. These ideas are a starting point. Studies like this are laying the groundwork for successful implementation. These are not radical ideas, but practical context-based strategies that have in some cases already seen success through other projects. We are building on what we have already learned. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Justine. So Justine is on the call. It's just early in the morning in New York, so we thought we would give her a chance to get some coffee and use the video presentation. Justine's work and part of the work that EcoShape are doing with WWF fall under our Resilient Asian Deltas initiative. Now, a key pillar of that is building with nature. So we hope what Justine and EcoShape have put together for us actually helps us catalyze large-scale NBS, starting in the Mekong, but moving to the rest of Asia's mega deltas. What Justine had shared in the last slide in terms of how to finance it was the other key question that I mentioned. And the next presentation will start to go into a bit more detail in that. So this is a piece of work that Pegasus have been leading for us under our Blue Heart of Africa initiative. And again, we have, like our Resilient Asian Deltas initiative, the Blue Heart of Africa initiative also includes a specific pillar of work on implementing large-scale nature-based solutions. And we're a little bit more further advanced in that. And what we'd like to share with you is some of our early thinking on how to finance this, and with examples from Rwanda, Kenya, and Zambia. Anirudh, over to you. And just a quick reminder, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Justine and Anirudh are with us, so we can take those questions. And Brahm will monitor that. Anirudh, over to you.
Thanks, Dean. And I hope everyone can see my screen. I can kind of see it on mine.
Yeah,
so
that's good.
Should be good to go. Excellent. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from Cape Town. It's a pleasure to be here. And first, I'd like to thank the WWF team for inviting us to share some of our work with this audience. My name is Anirudh, and I'm a principal at Pegasus, a South African-based public sector consultancy. We work on a range of sectors, from infrastructure financing and transaction advisory to solid waste management, water management, and transport. I myself am a city planner and economist, and largely work on projects in the city, in the company's cities practice. And we mostly focus on urban governance, data analytics, and sustainability. As Dean mentioned, I'm very happy today to present some of our work on 3 nature-based solutions in Rwanda, Kenya, and Zambia. The objective of our project was twofold. First, we wanted to describe 3 large-scale NBS projects that have emerged in Rwanda, Kenya, and Zambia as being viable projects. In some ways, we're going beyond just describing them, but actually trying to make the case that these projects are economically desirable and financially feasible. If we can fully understand and catalog all the overarching costs and benefits and find funders and funding models that suit the relevant context and project. Second, we wanted to broadly outline how these projects might be implemented. Here we're looking at a few innovative financing models that reflect conversations that we've had with various stakeholders, as well as the data that has been made available to us. We've centered our efforts on first understanding sources of upfront financing, then proceeding to understanding the potential source of revenue over time, before I try to identify anchor institutions that might be best placed to implement these projects. We caution that our activities are high-level exercises. The truth is that, as suggested by the title of this conversation, implementing large NBS projects for water and adaptation ain't that easy. And I'd also just like to add that we were very much building off the work of other folks, including the consultancy firm Deltaris and WWF. So we're definitely not coming up with these ideas in a vacuum, but merely packaging them, we hope, in an interesting way. I'll start by highlighting our overarching conceptual model, or our mental model. We start with the primary problem, which in each of these scenarios is flooding or drought. So either lots of water or very little water. To mitigate the issue, there are 3 primary things a policymaker can do. Option 1 is do nothing, which has its risks as well as its benefits. Doing nothing can make sure that existing jobs are not affected in the short run and that no financial costs are borne by government, again, in the short run. But as we all know, these have serious long-run implications and will lead to serious impacts, are likely to lead to serious impacts. Option 2 is to build traditional gray infrastructure, so dams, dikes, concrete drains, and such. These have the benefit of often solving the problem at hand, but can be expensive to construct and might be expensive to maintain. Also, gray infrastructure, however well it's designed, also has the potential to create other problems in the long run. For example, flooding, which is mitigated in one part of the city, might simply be redirected to another part of the city. Option number 3 is to construct nature-based solutions. They might be cheaper in terms of the upfront costs, that it might not require all of the complex engineering of traditional gray infrastructure, and operating costs as well, given the ability for natural ecosystems to be resilient to future changes. We want to emphasize that we're well aware that purely nature-based solutions do not exist, and the truth is that gray and green infrastructure exists on a spectrum. However, we're using this framework to better highlight the suite of options for policymakers as well as the opportunity. A quick description of our context. In Kigali, we're focusing on restoring, maintaining, and preserving wetlands in urban areas to solve the problem of urban flooding. Flooding affects a range of stakeholders, including urban households, public spaces, such as large bus stops, markets, etc., and businesses. And one way this can be mitigated is to preserve the wetlands. Kigali is a very hilly area, and the wetlands largely exist in the valleys. And essentially what happens is that all the rain flows from the hills down to the wetlands. And this can create flooding if there's stuff built on those wetlands, but can mitigate flooding if those areas are permeable. Kigali is one place in our three contexts where wetland preservation is already underway and has been taken in some areas, but not all. And the question here is really about taking the NBS concept and really scaling it across the entire city. In Kenya, we focus on Lamu, in particular the coastal mangroves in the coastal areas of Lamu. Here again, the problem is coastal flooding, as well as flooding that results from excess rain, which tends to flood the city. And mangroves can help prevent this. Flooding across the Kenyan coast is likely to affect businesses and industry in these areas, as well as industries around the ports and urban households, and other sort of livelihood activities such as tourism, fishing, etc. Finally, in Zambia, we're looking at the Lukanga Swans, which are located in the upper middle Kafue basin. These are permanent swamps that are located approximately 50 kilometers west of the city of Kabwe in the central province of Zambia within the catchment of the Kafue. The swamps essentially influence water flows into the Teshi Reservoir located downstream of the Kafue. And the swamps have this sort of sponge effect, which effectively attenuates or regulates water flow. So entities that are affected by the swamps tend to be downstream, and these include businesses, industries, utilities, and households. When we undertake our evaluation, what we're really doing is evaluating the benefits of preserving what already exists naturally, coupled with sort of deliberate efforts to enhance naturally occurring vegetation. In Kigali, we're talking about keeping wetlands the way they are and diverting harmful economic activity away from them. We're also constructing some drains. In Kenya, we're talking about mangroves and potentially additional infrastructure, such as a semi-permeable seawall. In Zambia, we're talking about swamp preservation and also some restoration. We'll now get into some of the details around our cost-benefit analysis without boring you with too many of them. The first thing we want to highlight is that in all three contexts, there are immediate benefits, and then there's some sort of ancillary benefits. To us, the immediate benefits often come in the form of flood risk mitigation. Here, we're looking to estimate the benefits that would be avoided. We essentially estimate the benefits by costing the damage that is avoided by flooding. In addition to these sort of primary benefits, there are secondary benefits, which might include better quality water, especially groundwater, and access to urban recreational spaces, carbon sequestration, etc. But often it's the case that downstream benefits are lumped into the primary benefits when making economic and financial viability calculations. But we want to focus on the very concrete activity this would allow us, very concrete benefits, as this would allow us to make a better case to finance this infrastructure. However, it should be noted that because we're not including these other benefits, the IRRs that we produce might be a lot lower than what other economists might obtain. Although generally the IRRs, the rate of return, are very sensitive to what you include and what you don't, so you could get huge differences. But let's start with Kigali, which is the country where we have the most amount of information. In terms of cost of these interventions, the wetland restoration, we draw on the work of Deltares, which estimated both the approximate capital expenditure of setting up the NBS and the expected operational cost of maintaining those wetlands. As one can see, the costs are substantial. If this were to be expanded across the entire cities, where wetlands make up almost 7,700 hectares. It's about 10% of the entire area of the city. Here, when we're describing this, we're really looking at flood damage. So when we're talking about Kigali, we're really talking about flood damage. And so we're trying to estimate two things. First, we want to estimate flood damage to urban households and here we use hedonic regression analyses. Essentially, what we want to do is estimate the higher rents paid by those that live in dwellings that are not flooded annually. As this information gives us how much people value for not being flooded, and more concretely, the damage that is inflicted to these people. Of course, there's like physical and mental damage, but we're really talking, we're assuming that the increase in the rents that people pay is equivalent to the damage that they would incur, that would incur on their house. And we obtained this information using the National Household Survey. In addition, we draw on information produced by SMEC, which is an engineering firm, which undertook a brief cost-benefit analysis on their own, separate to this one. And they base their estimates on flood damage. They base their estimates of flood damage or flood risk mitigation on road damage that would occur in a different context. They base it on a case in Uganda. And they estimate that it's around about $7,000 US, I believe, per hectare. And so we've used what they've used to estimate the benefits of flood mitigation. And based on these two, sort of the cost over here and the benefits over here, we run a model and we estimate the sort of rate of return between 10 and 14%. Again, as mentioned before, these numbers are often very sensitive to changes. So, I mean, what it does show us is that these things are financially viable, or at least economically viable. But that, you know, these things often, they're very sensitive, is what I'd caution. In Kenya, we've had to be a lot more creative about in terms of how we've sought different information. And so we've drawn a lot of stuff from academic literature to give us a sense of what might be required to implement an NBS on the Lamu coast. In this circumstance, we're looking to estimate the benefits of a combined NBS and grey infrastructure project, as well as just an NBS project. We're to draw on a similar exercise that was conducted in Indonesia, actually, to give us an estimate of the costs in terms of the OPEX and CAPEX. On the benefit side, so this is the cost side. On the benefit side, we drew on the work of an academic, a researcher, who was doing work on the Tana River basin, and he estimated the mitigated floods that might be accrued to urban households, and we use the same value over here. We're not pulling in the benefits that might accrue to businesses in the port of Lamu, and therefore estimates again are likely to be a lot lower. And further, the cost of our intervention might be miscalibrated because we're drawing on instances from around the world. But we've done what we can given the constraints, and again, we come up with the rate of return that is positive and significant. And finally, in the case of Zambia, we draw cost information on similar projects that were funded by Jeff in the Bangwelu wetlands. And we break this down per hectare and then apply it to the Lukanga context. On the benefit side, we draw on information produced by another company called Deltaris to estimate the damage that might be caused by flooding on various utilities. This is the cost side, and we have the benefit side over here. Again, our IRR is positive and significant. I should say that the benefit side, we're drawing primarily on information that was made available to us. And here we're talking about risks to revenues risk to revenues. Essentially, there's two utilities. There's an energy utility and a water utility, and we're estimating the amount that they would benefit from. Essentially they have risk to their revenues if the water upstream is inconsistent, and this is the estimated risk. So now we spent some time going through the economic benefits and costs of each of these activities. And our general takeaway point is that these are interesting projects, but based on rough estimates, but that they're generally positive for society. Not only that, but they have a material and financial benefit for various beneficiaries. At this point, we'll sort of transition to the second part of our project, which was to share a few ideas on how these projects could be financed. We emphasize could here because there are infinite ways that things could be done, and we're merely suggesting a few options. Again, getting things done ain't easy, and there's a lot of detail that we're glossing over that will need to be handled at an implementation stage. But to begin with, I'll share our mental model. Financing any project comes down to understanding how money can be raised based on anticipated future flows of income. This can be used to seek out upfront financing. And a good sort of example would be a mortgage on a house. Any upfront financing needs to be paid with future money earned, which requires a clear understanding of what you're going to be earning through your job. In the case of an NBS, it'll come through the benefits these solutions can bring and how they can be monetized. And we broadly classify these revenue streams as taxes and tariffs. In the case of projects that we're evaluating, there's an argument to be made that the economic benefits are great enough that governments and philanthropists might be compelled to pay for these projects without requiring exact payment back. And these could be termed as transfers. And most of our work sort of hinges on balancing the concept of taxes, tariffs, and transfers in a way that makes projects more feasible. It also centers on the importance of an anchoring institution when implementing an NBS. Let's begin, and I hope this was somewhat clear. We'll begin with Rwanda in terms of how a financing solution might be conceived of. Rwanda is possibly the most straightforward example too. Here, imagine that the NBS intervention could be financed through public entities, that is through the fiscus, grants or concessional loans, to ensure that funds are managed properly. A fund like what exists in the country already, it's called FNEWA, maybe used to channel money and manage projects. This type of entity would also have the added responsibility of bundling or finding the most appropriate schemes using various sources of finance that they received. So funds like FNEWA basically focus on promoting green investments, and often they're well placed to do this. So taking different sources of money and create a new financial product that can be used to pay for a nature-based solution. In the future, potential revenue sources in the case of Rwanda may include benefits or revenues from ecotourism revenues, property taxes, urban agriculture. Rwanda may also be able to make the case that NBS interventions sequester carbon and therefore allow them to sell carbon credits. Urban agriculture, while quite small, may also be able to generate future revenues that can be monetized. In the case of Lamu, we propose a slightly different variation. Here we imagine an anchor institution such as the Lamu Port Authority, aka LAPSED, or the Kenyan Tourism Board, both of which are parastatal entities, raising funds to finance an NBS with debt financing, such as a bond issue. This can be tricky in some contexts, but should a parastatal not be able to raise funds, it is conceivable that another institution operating on behalf of the parastatal, such as a multilateral development bank, could raise those funds. In one scenario, we imagine parastatal issuing bonds to be purchased by ESG investors and institutional investors, with bond dividends being paid through tariffs levied on companies that operate within the Port Authority or operate tourist infrastructure along the Kenyan coast. Outside funding via grants, however, are also critical to ensure the creditworthiness of the parastatal through guarantees, as this would ensure that bondholders are more likely to feel confident that their dues will be paid. Our final model in Zambia focuses on the importance of the Lukanga Swans for ensuring a consistent flow of water to downstream users. As mentioned before, the swamps essentially manage water flowing into the Iteshi Reservoir, which is important for hydropower, as well as for the water utility, the Lusaka water utility, which distributes water to the city. And based on this hydrogeology, we propose an alternative model where the hydropower company, ZESCO, serves as an anchoring institution, or ZESCO combined with the Lusaka Water and Sewerage Company. In this scenario, I guess the two combined would have the technical and managerial expertise to essentially receive funds from grants or from a body that makes concessional loans, and channel those funds to NGOs or local government institutions to conserve the swamps and restore areas that are at risk. And yeah, essentially, they would create a water fund. I think that sort of sums up our three scenarios. Gone through these very, very quickly, but hope you're able to capture some key elements. And yeah, obviously this takes a lot more time and energy in terms of actually implementing, but we hope we've achieved, at least come to some understanding of what would make a good start. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anirudh. That was quite insightful. So we've already got some questions coming in, and this is the slot where you can ask Justine and Anirudh a few questions. So perhaps Justine, I'll start with you. There's a question about stakeholder engagement, right? And given that the Mekong, and as we know, you've seen there are many different stakeholders, all with different interests. So do you have any insight into, or have you run into any problems when trying to include different stakeholders, and how you approach that?
Thanks. I think it's a great question. And, you know, at this stage in the project, we are really benefiting from the fact that we have WWF's local team on the ground in Vietnam, and the ongoing engagement at Tram Chin National Park. So to date in the project, we've been relying on the folks who are in Vietnam to sort of speak for those communities in terms of what might work. But I think going forward, what's really critical is to engage in a dialogue. And in the presentation, I outlined many different ways that the proposal might pair nature-based solutions and conservation with livelihood models. And I think that it necessitates conversations with local community members to understand which of those livelihood models, whether that is about training and innovation, whether seasonal ecotourism is of interest, changing the crops, you know, those are many other solutions. And that has to be a conversation and discussion to identify what are the most compelling strategies for economic development alongside conservation. And I think the next stages of the project would begin to have those conversations and help us develop the direction forward.
Great. Thanks, Justine. There's another question. We'll stay with the Mekong, but I think I'll give this one to Stu. So Stu, you might talk to it from a perspective of resilient Asian deltas and what we're doing on the Vietnam rice and shrimp work. But there's a question from Miriam Potton. What she's asking is, you know, how do we implement a regional solution on a local scale? And how do we bring in farmers into the context of that, particularly when it comes to compensation? So I thought maybe you could offer some insight from some of the work we're doing in RAD.
Yeah, thanks. It follows on from what Justine is saying. I think having teams on the ground in these countries is one of our added advantages to putting these projects together. It's very important to recognize that the projects you've seen today really did come from the local teams in conversations with local universities, with local governments, and with communities, either based on other projects we were working in or an expansion of projects that were stuck and we were looking for new ways of doing something. But certainly, if I look at our bankable finance work in the Mekong with shrimp farmers and rice farmers, they have been the ones determining the boundaries of that work, and we've been listening to them and working with them in stakeholder consultation, and that's allowed us to have not just incredibly rich insights, but really to have their sanction and their support in the projects going forward. So none of this work is top down. All of it is very much coming from our local context. But you can never underestimate the role and the importance of that consultation and those conversations. So I think the question for me is is on the flip of what you've said, Miriam, and that is, how do we take these really good local projects and scale them to a regional level? That's when it's starting to get trickier, particularly when you start to cross jurisdictions and you get into different budgets and different political economies in the sense. Luckily, from what you've seen today, that's pretty contained. But I think that's one of the great challenges of scaling nature-based solutions or replicating them going forward. But the main point is this: if you don't have the locals on board, you're not going to go very far. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Stu. Anirudh, the next one's for you. So what do you see as the largest hurdle in convincing stakeholders to invest in large-scale NBS? Particularly from a government perspective, right? And some of the models you put up, of course, have parastatals at the center, which means we need them to make it work. But useful if you could offer any insights.
Sure. Thanks, Dean. It's a good question. I think I'll put out sort of three ideas here. try to expand on them a little bit. The first one is sort of getting enough data to get concrete about the benefits of nature-based solutions. There's some data that's available about undertaking, and we tried to do this at a very high level, undertake a cost-benefit analysis, but getting very concrete about splitting those benefits into the ones that will yield a very clear financial revenue stream, and ones that will impact society in an economic sense, and separating the two and getting very, very concrete about what those two are, and quantifying that very clearly is one thing. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done on that front. This is somewhat new as a sort of asset class, as a sort of type of infrastructure, and understanding a little bit more about the benefits financially, economically, and how it applies in certain circumstance is important for government institutions and for lending institutions to promote this type of infrastructure. The second one, my second point kind of builds off the first, but it was understanding the revenue streams, the potential revenue streams, and the benefits. So we've discussed, for example, in the case of Kigali, we've discussed the potential for carbon credits. This is a little bit high level, but one could start to estimate that. And getting a very clear sense of what could be earned through carbon credits is one way of quantifying this in a better sense, and getting more support, both from multilateral development banks as well as on the government side. We've mentioned the case of parastatal entities. In the case of many government institutions in developing countries, a lot of it comes down to sort of state capacity, the ability to receive funds and deliver and sort of implement projects. That requires a certain amount of managerial capacity. That requires a certain amount of transparency in terms of collecting funds, ensuring that they're sort of ring fenced and then delivered towards nature-based solutions. And then building off that, if we want to channel new sort of innovative sources of finance, if we want to blend different sources of finance, there needs to be some capacity, state capacity to produce new types of financial products to fund different infrastructure. So it's a combination of capacity and information, I'd say, on multiple fronts.
Great. Thanks, Sunny. So, Brahm, I don't see any new questions in the chat or under the Q&A tab. But if maybe what I could do is one for Justine and I, same question is, what next? So where to from here in terms of these cases? You've dealt with some of the stakeholders and engaged with them, both the Mekong side and the Africa side. But what would be a good next step to start bringing these into reality? Yeah.
I think this actually speaks to Anirudh's last answer. We need to pursue the next steps of making this more concrete. And some of that means analysis, design and engineering analysis. And some of that means having the conversations with local governments, local communities to refine the propositions. So at this stage, they are fairly conceptual, and the goal is to bring people around the table to discuss what's working and what can be improved. There are also some concrete things like understanding sediment dynamics and performing that analysis that will help us understand whether or not the proposal for mangrove regeneration can succeed. So I think it's, getting down on the ground and also to take the design to the next stage in development.
Sorry, I unmuted myself. I think Justine sort of mentioned the sort of data analytics side of things. Maybe I'll mention the state capacity side of things. So I think on our side, one part of this, of course, would be talking to the various entities, the anchoring institutions that would be responsible for implementing these types of activities, and so getting a better sense of what the capacity is internally, what the other institutions that, so for example, in Zambia, is it the utility? Which utility is the best place to undertake this? Would it be the energy utility or would it be the water utility? And is there a way to facilitate a conversation between both of them? those sort of dynamics, understanding who's best placed to undertake a certain activity, and then what exactly that activity is. We're talking about restoration of the Lukanga Swans, so we need to know what that means concretely. It's understanding more, both in terms of the science of the actual intervention as well as the people who are going to intervene. I'd say on the finance, there's obviously stuff on the financing side as well. And so conversations with multilateral development banks, which are often the lenders in developing country contexts, is important, as well as starting conversations with other sort of impact investors, impact financiers, and grant-making institutions. So yeah, a lot of more data collection is what I'd say, Dean.
Great. Thanks, Anirudh. And Stu, maybe one last thing before we begin to wrap up. I mean, often the discussion when it comes to nature-based solutions and the conservationists in the room is that it should center around a biodiversity benefit, but it's not always easy to sell biodiversity. So how should we think about this? But with the recognition that the biodiversity benefits are crucial to this. But if we're going to get this at the right kind of scale with the right kind of investment, then how do we balance the two?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think a lot of the discussion inside some of the conservation organizations has been primarily starting from the conservation output, and I think again one of our learnings is that that's the wrong way to approach this. I think that you have to be answering the question that's been answered today, which is, what is the societal problem you're trying to fix, and then work back from there. I mean, obviously, what we're talking about relies on ecological processes to solve part of the problem, not completely. As Anirudh said, there's still a huge role that gray infrastructure is going to play in this world. But we also, I mean, for organizations like ourselves, yes, we do seek to find those outputs that are of benefit to us. I think in many ways that's answered through the work we're doing anyway. But there's another question in the chat box I think is important, because what we've heard a lot about today is benefits from a financial perspective for governments in order to make the business case to invest in the NBS. But I think the other thing we've got to be mindful of, and it goes to some of the questions in the chat box around stakeholders and those kinds of things, is if you can't articulate the benefits to people, you are also in trouble. This can't, and this goes to your question, Dean, this is not about nature. This is not about nature conservation per se. It's about solving the societal problem and making sure that the benefits are there for the communities that are going to be affected by or improved by these interventions. And that's also going to be vital, not just in the argumentation, but in the long-term efficacy and survival of these projects. Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe, Anirudh, we could probably take that question. We have a bit of time, but essentially, is who is the problem owner and who feels responsible for this, right? And that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, in the cases, what we've tried to do is center on a government institution. Of course, we're focusing, well, I guess there's primary benefits again in our sort of mental model. There's primary benefits, secondary benefits. The secondary benefits are often the society, the folks, broader society, the folks who are impacted by a flooding issue or a drought issue. The primary benefits, in order to make these investments a little bit more bankable, we're focusing on in this circumstance are institutions that would be monetarily or adversely affected by a flood. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and I think we're focusing on certain key stakeholders that will be able to pay for this type of intervention, because we're focusing on the revenue streams. We want to finance this thing, but there's many economic cases to be made. The financial cases are important, but the economic case is important too, and that's where it's important to understand the broader sort of secondary benefits to society and to quantify that as much as possible. And there's many lending institutions that will support something like this based on the economic benefits rather than just the financial.
Great. Thanks, Anirudh. And maybe just to build on that, Miriam, because when we conceptualize some of this work with Deltaris, as you mentioned, our approach was to try and solve somebody else's problem. We know we work in the Lukanga Swamps as WWF because it's a Ramsar site. It's a wetland of international importance. We know why we're in the Mekong, because it's a biodiversity hotspot. But what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve? And inevitably, if it's a societal challenge, you can make the case for the government. Yesterday, we had the Pakistani minister on stage. We had the director of climate change in Vietnam talking about exactly that, how they see this from their perspective as a public challenge that needs to be solved. And tomorrow we'll have the African ministers on stage talking about the very same thing in the 3 cases that you've just heard. So governments are certainly starting to recognize that these are issues that they need to get a handle on. And the question that we get from most of them is they're not anti-nature-based solutions or addressing these issues, but how do they do it? That's the question. Okay, so with that, I am going to turn over to Amrit Kado van der Lely. Amrit is one of the young professionals working with WaterNet. He's just seen the cases like all of you, so he's going to give us some final reflections before we wrap up.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Justin and Anarud, for your presentations, and also Stuart for your wise words there at the end. Very interesting way of approaching the building with nature, and how you phrased it. Myself, I'm an ecologist at Deltares, and I've been doing building with nature now, I think, or nature-based solutions for the last 6 years. So I've been hearing your lessons learned, and I see many similarities. But one of my biggest frustrations actually during these projects was also always trying to convince people of the importance of nature. So I very much like what you said, Stuart, when you said we're not just doing conservation, but we're actually solving societal issues. That's something that I'm going to take with me and use as a way to convince governments to invest in these type of projects. Firstly, what I found very funny, what both Justine and Anarud mentioned during their presentation, was that, well, Justine said no one size fits all and infinite ways of getting things done, Anarud. And I think that's also very characteristic of building with nature projects, is that they're so flexible in nature, and that we're still learning how to do this. And I've had to have that similar type of attitude also when implementing my building with nature projects, both in Indonesia or in Mexico. And I think it very much showcases that, that type of mentality, even though most of us are experts or it's very technical, we need to remain flexible and capitalize on opportunities when we try to implement nature-based solutions. But what I also wanted to mention was that I very much liked hearing your stories, because it builds on this narrative that nature-based solutions are not just effective means of disaster risk reduction, that they're not just ways of conserving biodiversity, but that they're financially feasible projects. I think that we can try to, I don't think there's any more room for naysayers nowadays. And so I very much appreciate you sharing this information with us. I'm going to use I'm looking forward to reading your reports. And I'm going to use this also as a way to continue my fight to implement nature-based solutions around the world, and use it as as I said, as a narrative to show people that it works on every level. Thank you very much to all of you.
Great. Thanks, Amrit. Then on that note, I see nothing else in the chat, Bram, or any other questions. So I think we can wrap up. Huge thank you to Anirudh and Justine for making the time to present and share some of the work that they're doing. And Stu and Amrit for joining the session. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to be with us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you're dialing in from. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks to you, especially Dean, for hosting and moderating this session. And thanks all speakers, and thanks for everyone for the interesting questions and your time and attention for this session. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
You too.